Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Helen. I am currently a senior at the Harker School and serve as a vice president for WISDom. It is my pleasure to be moderating our late morning keynote today with Dr. Ryan Calo. Before we begin, I would like to inform you that we will be reserving the last 15 minutes or so of this keynote session as Q&A time with Dr. Calo. At the bottom of your screen, you will notice a Q&A icon. Feel free to put in any questions you have for Dr. Calo there at any time during his talk. Everyone in the webinar can see all the asked questions. So if you want to ensure that a question is answered, you can also upvote that question using the same Q&A functionality. Without further ado, allow me to introduce our speaker today. Professor Calo is the Lane Powell and D. Wayne Gittinger Professor at the University of Washington School of Law. He holds courtesy appointments in the Information School and Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering. With colleagues, Professor Calo founded the Text Policy Lab, which helps policymakers create wiser, more inclusive tech policy, and the Center for an Informed Public, which studies and combats misinformation. Professor Calo is a leading scholar of law and emerging technology, especially privacy, robotics, and artificial intelligence. Today, he will be discussing various cases over the years where courts have had to make hard decisions about robots and what those cases teach us about automation, the law, and ourselves. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Calo. We are so glad to have you with us this morning.
Thank you so much, Helen. I really am honored to be able to participate in the Harker Symposium this year. I was supposed to last year, and of course we got postponed. So it's a pleasure to be able to do this. I'm actually on my way to you all in a sense. I'm traveling from Seattle, where University of Washington is, to San Francisco, actually, and I'm at the midway point. I'm somewhere in Oregon, coming to you from somewhere in Oregon right now. So as Helen said, I'm a law professor, and so my training is in law, and but I'm really excited about and do a lot of work at the intersection of law and other disciplines, and so the Tech Policy Lab, which the organizers asked me to say a couple words about, is really maybe interesting for your purposes, because what we do is we put our students from different disciplines into interdisciplinary teams in order to do research on cutting edge issues of emerging technology. And so we've worked on augmented reality, which I saw on your slide. We worked on robotics, which I saw in your slideshow. We've worked on many of the issues that I know that you all do in your symposium and over the course of the year pedagogically. So it's exciting to be able to talk to you. But today I'm going to specifically talk to you about robots. And so I'm going to start to share my screen here, and hopefully this will go well. Hold on a second. Let me just, okay. And then, all right, Helen, can you give me a little thumbs up if you can see this? Okay. Great. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about robots and the law. And specifically, I'm going to talk about the way that courts and judges have had to grapple with issues of robotics over the years. So this is me when I was like as young as I think that you even enroll. This is like I'm younger than my daughter, my youngest daughter in this picture. So I've been interested in robots for a long time, as you can see. But robots have been around for even longer. The funny thing about robots is they always seem to sort of perennially represent the future. Like no matter if it's 1920 or 1930 or 1980 or 2021, whenever we think of robots, we think of the future, and we have for many, many years. It's a bit of an irony about robots. So today we're talking about that Boston Dynamic robots, Atlas, that can do all those amazing things and flips and dance and everything else. But it's on a continuum for many, many decades of robotics. So robots have been with us though always heralds of the future, they've been with us for a very long time. And so we shouldn't really be surprised that occasionally they have led to legal disputes. And so, for example, this is a case from the turn of the 19th century, from 1887, wherein it wasn't a robot exactly, but it was like the first vending machines. And there was a question about whether or not if you used like a wooden nickel instead of a real nickel, whether you had stolen from or defrauded this machine, which was, of course, just a vending machine. And it was this really great case where the court was sort of grappling with, have you really done the thing that we worry about with fraud or stealing, when the thing that you tricked and defrauded was just a machine. So I want to talk a little bit about cases like this, where courts are really struggling with what to do in the face of automation, what to do in the face of robotics. But first, I want to talk about a few things I'm not going to talk about. In previous work years ago, I wrote about the way that judges use the metaphor of a robot, like where there's no robot before the court, there's nothing about robotics, they just use the robot as a metaphor. So like, for example, it wasn't this person's fault, she was just a robot of this other person. Or we can't expect jurors to behave robotically when they're in the face of witness testimony. All these ways in which judges have used robots as similes or metaphors. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about real robots before the court. But I'm also not talking about cases where robots are just incidental. So there have been a number of really interesting cases where, there was a robot involved, but that wasn't a big part of it. So, for example, there was this scary book by Stephen King, where the whole premise of it is that robots come alive and threaten us. And ironically, on the set of that movie, when it was turned into a movie, one of the props, a automated a lawnmower, suddenly started up without reason and just started chasing after a camera person who was actually injured and running away from it. And there was a lawsuit about this. But the fact that it was just a lawnmower prop versus a light falling from the ceiling, it wasn't really about robotics in a deep way. It was just ironic and funny. So I'm not talking about cases like that. I'm talking about cases where it really mattered that it was a robot, where the reason the case was hard for the court to decide was because a robot was involved. Now, I'm sure many of you know from just like watching television, how it works. Like there's one or more, or two or more litigants. They come to the court, they ask the court to resolve some dispute. In this particular case from the 1950s, illustrated here, what happened was that in the 1950s, we began to, in the United States, to import robot toys from Japan. So there was like a robotics toy craze in Japan, and they made these toys that were robots, and we began to import them here into the United States. And the question before the court was, what was the right tax? What was the right tariff? The amount of money that you pay when you import something from another jurisdiction. What was the correct tariff to use here? And the problem is that because of historic arrangements especially with Europe, the tariff for importing dolls was different from the tariff for importing other kinds of toys, including like mechanical toys. So for example, if you're importing a toy train, it's a different tariff than if you're importing a doll. And the way that doll was defined was that a doll represented something animate, represented something alive. So the court had to figure out whether a robot represented something animate. And the court just didn't know what to do with it. And they said, well, I guess, this is 1950s, remember? So they said, well, I guess a robot represents something animate because it's a mechanical man, they said, mechanical person, we would say. But you know what? They said, ultimately, they said a toy robot doesn't represent something animate because a toy robot represents a robot, which represents a person. And so the toy robot represents something inanimate, and we're going to charge the tariff rate that we would charge to non-dolls. So then this issue came up again because then they started to import this particular robot that you see in front of you, where as you can tell, there's like a kind of a visor, and behind the visor, it looks like there's a person. And so this is like the swivel-o-matic astronaut. And so then the importers came back again and said, well, this time, surely, that this must be representing something animate, because you can see it represents an astronaut. And the court had to say, well, no, this is so similar to the last one. And, even though it's true that there's like a part of it that looks human, This really is a robot suit, and you can tell. And they said things like, because after all, people and astronauts don't have guns that come out of their chests. This must actually really be, in the way that it's depicted here, the robot is gigantic. This is not representing somebody real. We're not going to call it a doll either. This question of whether or not robots represented, what they like how to categorize robots, it came up so often that eventually they had to make a change to the tariff schedule, the laws that govern tariffs, in order to make sure that there was a separate category that mentions monsters and robots in particular. So remember again that what the court was struggling with is this a machine or is this a person? Okay. This has come up again in the law governing rights of publicity. So the idea of rights of publicity is the idea that if you're a person and someone else represents you in some way, so for example, there's a car commercial and you get a Dolly Parton lookalike, or Dolly Parton, or you hear, or even someone's voice that sounds like Dolly Parton, or sounds like James Earl Jones, or sounds like somebody really recognizable. If you reproduce that person's likeness in order to sell stuff, you can violate what's called their rights of publicity. What happened in the 1990s was that Samsung made an ad, and you can see it depicted here, where they made a robot version of Vanna White, who was famously associated with, obviously a television show. And she was so closely associated with the television show Wheel of Fortune that just depicting a robot who is a blonde wig and there's a wheel and there's these letters, that according to the court was enough to signal that this robot was actually supposed to be Vanna White. But again, the court had a terrible time, and there was a dissent, meaning there were judges who disagreed with the majority judges in the Ninth Circuit, and they said, no. Obviously, one is a woman who is this like celebrity. She's this blonde woman. She's on television, and the other is just a robot. Whereas the other set of judges were so incredibly convinced, like obviously this is just a robot Vanna White. She has a right in her publicity. And so it was like this tough thing. Like if they had put a regular person up there and just called it Vanna White, or if they made it look too much like Vanna White, she obviously would have had a cause of action. But they struggled because it was a robot, and it's so unclear what category a robot falls into. This happened also with a couple of I hope you will pardon. I know this is a high school and middle school crowd. Potentially, hope you'll pardon the reference to alcohol here, but this is from a famous a TV show from decades ago called Cheers, which take place in a bar. And there were these two particularly regulars who came, Cliff and Norm, and they were very well known. They used to always sit at the bar. And what happened was that a company made robot animatronic versions of them and put them in a bar inside of an airport. And so you go to the airport bar and there would be these people, Cliff and Norm, that you associate with Cheers, but no one paid them anything, and no one asked their opinion about it. And so there was another fight about whether these robot versions of these characters could in turn be thought of as the people themselves. And once again, the court said that was a possibility. One of my favorite examples, and maybe some of you are aware of Chuck E. Cheese. I know growing up on the East Coast, that was certainly a thing. But Chuck E. Cheese is a restaurant where it's a pizza restaurant with a bunch of games and toys and stuff like that, and so it's for kids. And what happens at Chuck E. Cheese, or what used to happen, was there was this animatronic robot band that would every once in a while just start playing music. And it would, you can see them, they move around and sort of, they would, clap, and they would play instruments, and the kids would stop what they were doing and watch. It was mesmerizing. So in Maryland, again in the 1990s, in the mid 1990s, this tax authority in Maryland, basically like the sort of IRS of Maryland, looked at this and said, wait a second. If this looks like this is a performance, and if you're having a performance, then we have to charge a performance tax on the food that you served. Because if you're showing a movie, or you're actually not a movie, but if you're doing a live performance, like you're doing theater, dinner theater, or jazz, or comedy, you have to pay a performance tax on the food that you serve. And Chuck E. Cheese wasn't doing that. So they went after Chuck E. Cheese and asked them for all this money for the performance tax. And Chuck E. Cheese objected and said, this isn't really a performance. And so a court had to decide whether robot musicians were actually really performing. And what the court said, after much agonizing, once again, because it wasn't clear, they said, well, performance requires spontaneity. Performance requires, that there's a possibility that each performance will be different, and that it's somehow inspired by human intent. And so because performance requires spontaneity, these robots do the same thing every time. They're not performing. And so there's no need to have a performance tax on the food that you serve. Whereas, the other side was vehemently the opposite. No, what are you talking about? How is this different from there just being people up there performing just because they're robots? So what I found so interesting about this is that the court may have been right in that context. I'm not sure I know. Maybe they weren't performing for these purposes. But today we do think of robots as performing, or at least being spontaneous. And so when I was in Berlin a few years ago, I was walking around the streets of Berlin, Germany, and I saw this sign that said, "Get your portrait drawn by 5 robots." One of them was broken, so it was only 4. And I went there and I sat in a chair, and they had these robots that were built, and the robots took a picture of me, and in 5 different robots in 5 different styles all drew me. And I was told that, of course, if I did it again, it would all be different. And the idea was that there was a performative aspect of it. And the thing that the robots produced was different each time, even with the same subject. And so it would not have met the definition of the Chuck E. Cheese case in Maryland. And indeed, it would be harder. And there's a lot of conversation nowadays about whether or not things that are created by robots are in fact copyrightable if they're made by robots. Okay. So another interesting case that takes us a little further away from performance and entertainment is a case that will require a bit of explanation, but it's the question of how much do we attribute robot discovery and robot interaction to the people that made and deployed the robot? So let me see what I mean. So what happened was that, again, in the 1990s, a lot of this action took place in the 50s and the 90s, and then I think more recently. But what was happening in the 1990s was that there had been some major innovations in undersea exploration, and they had to do primarily with sensors and the ability to detect things on the ground, on the seabed, with like radar and so on, and sonar primarily. And so sorry, there's a bit of a loud siren. Okay, so anyway, the point of the matter is that there had been some innovations that allowed ships to detect things that were on the seafloor. And in addition, there was this big boom of robotics. And so what happened was that a number of different companies that did undersea exploration began to use these sensors in order to find basically lost treasure. Find shipwrecks, and the ability to actually reach those shipwrecks once they found them using robots. So because this technology became available in the 1990s, a bunch of different places began to race one another to either go down to, either to discover new shipwrecks or to go down to the ones that had already been discovered with robots, because they had not been reachable by people before. Okay, and so using sort of these are more contemporary, but using robots like these. So the idea was that these robots would be able to visit. These actual robots here mostly are especially the Voyager. These are actually reconnaissance and exploration robots, okay? Which I'll get back to a moment. Anyway, the reason this is interesting from a legal perspective is because sometimes what would happen would be one of these companies would find some like Spanish gold, like in a shipwreck, like in a galleon, you know what I mean, from hundreds of years before, that was extremely valuable. And because it was full of gold or full of artifacts. And the question is that if you find a shipwreck and the original owner is not, available because this is hundreds of years old and they're long gone, then you have, and even if you can find the owner, you have this right of salvage. The idea is that you get to keep a piece of the shipwreck and its contents as a reward for having found it and recovered it. But the rule is that you actually have to exert exclusive possession and control over the shipwreck. And the way that had always been established was by the notion that you had been able to physically go visit it with your divers and manipulate it and take something back from it. Okay, so you get exclusive possession and control, and therefore the right of first salvage, and you can exclude other people that are trying to salvage the same valuable thing if you have the ability to go down there and physically see it and manipulate it and so on. So as these companies would race to figure out who could get to these shipwrecks first or who could find them, the way that they would show possession and control was by sending a robot down there, a robot that was teleoperated. And the idea is that the robot would be able to go down there, and the robot could send you really good footage and shine a light on it. And we've all seen like movies about, with this going on, and actually even have an actuator, like a robot arm that would be able to touch part of the shipwreck and even take something back from it. So a court had to decide in a really consequential decision in terms of money and future impact, whether or not visiting a shipwreck with a robot constituted possession of that shipwreck. And after sort of hemming and hawing and hearing all the different sides and going back and forth, finally the court comes up. Not only does it find that you can exclusively possess a shipwreck with a robot, but it makes this completely new doctrine that is called telepossession. A new doctrine with like 4 factors, like a 4-factor test that litigants have to use in order to be able to say that they have salvaged an underwater ship. And this doctrine was so important that it's actually the basis of the rights that were given around the Titanic. Because after this original Spanish galleon ship was found, it was called the CC Central America, I think. In any event, they subsequently found years later the Titanic, and the way that the Titanic salvage rights were established was through this famous doctrine of robotic telepossession. But again, what I want you to see about these cases is that in each case, the court is struggling with whether to characterize a person, a robot, as a machine or a person. And so, for example, in the in the case of salvage, the idea was, do you physically send? Do you have to have a real person be visiting this ship, or can a robot substitute for a person? That is very similar to the idea of, if you substitute a robot for a person, is that really them for purposes of right to publicity? Similarly, if you substitute robots from a performance that would usually be done by people, are they still performing? And you see this again and again and again. And my thought is that all these kinds of cases and others will become more and more important in the future. And one indication of that is, for example, the new frontier, so to speak, is going to be space exploration and the extraction of resources from near Earth objects. So we would be sending probes, unmanned robots, into space in order to identify asteroids and other bodies to extract resources from them. And there's a number of different companies that are exploring, some of them based in Seattle, some of them based in the Bay Area, others based in Florida for obvious reasons, who are exploring how to lay claim to resources that are extraterrestrial, that are outside of Earth. And so these doctrines, I would assume that they're going to be looking to these doctrines that govern undersea exploration, and that they're going to be a precedent, and they're going to cite to, the Spanish gold case and the Titanic case when they are looking at exploration. Okay, there are other examples of this as well. I wasn't sure how much time we were going to have together, but I think I have time to go into a couple other ones. I will say that I don't have slides for them because they're not easy to visually depict, and indeed I want to mention that some of them are a little more disturbing. So, for example, but not terribly disturbing. Otherwise, I wouldn't mention them. But one example, for example, is that there was a case where a person was being arrested, and police sent in a robot in order to, communicate with that person. I think that the robot was supposed to bring a cell phone and some water. And it was a teleoperated ground robot that was sent into this home because he was armed and they were worried. He had a shotgun and they were worried about the officer's safety. And so this individual got really upset with this robot and shot it a bunch of times, shot it with a shotgun many times. And the question was how much to enhance the penalties he got for resisting arrest, since he didn't shoot at a real person, but he damaged property. And again, the court had to decide, should we think of these robots as being like an extension of the officer, which would result in one kind of charge, or should we think of them just as any other kind of government property, and they'll have a different kind of idea. And in another case, a court was struggling with the idea of whether or not sending a machine into a home, not physically entering yourself, but getting, sending a machine into a house to steal something like a teleoperated robot, whether that constituted robbery and burglary, which is a more serious crime. Burglary is a more serious crime because it's a threat to people. You go into their dwelling, you're obviously potentially threatening a person in their own home. That's a more serious crime than other kinds of robbery. And so the court was weighing whether or not you could think of sending a machine into a house as being tantamount to it. And there are many others. In fact, I had recently was so glad and fun to learn that that in Europe, in a courthouse, there's going to be an art display depicting some of these cases that I found about robot law. One of which is the person who was supposedly resisting arrest because he shot a robot. Another one is the Chuck E. Cheese one. Another one is the deep sea exploration one. And they're being depicted in a permanent exhibit in a courthouse in Denmark. But anyway, there are more. So what do they all mean for us? I mean, so I just described, over the past, 50, 70 years, there's been courts grappling with what to do and how to characterize robots. What does it mean for us? Well, I think it means a few different things. So one of the things I think it means for us is that we have to just be candid about the difficulty that people have placing robots into a category. Are they machines? Are they like people? Because the law cares, and other institutions care, about whether something is a machine or something is a person. There's just different rules that govern things and people. Okay. So this difficulty that the courts have in categorizing whether something is a person or a thing really shouldn't be so surprising, because apparently it's a very common issue in psychology. And this paper, I love this paper. It's now decades old, but this paper is a paper between people working in psychology, as you can see at University of Washington, people like my colleague Peter Kahn, and people who are working in human-robot interaction and other disciplines. And what they did is they got together and they did experiments asking people to try to categorize for purposes of moral decision making and other kinds of things, whether it's okay to harm something, whether you can blame something, categorize robots as between people and not as between alive and not alive. And what they found was that absolutely consistently across different cultures, because they were looking at Japan and the United States, at least two cultures, consistent across age groups, so kids, preschoolers, but also adults, even people with great familiarity with machines because they're engineers, that consistently people had difficulty categorizing robots cleanly as either things or like people. So much so that they came up with this idea of a new ontological category, this ontological category hypothesis, by which it's just a fancy way of saying this is like a different kind of thing. It's a different group. It's a different category, either than people or machines. A book that I recommend if you are interested in this topic is a very new book called The New Breed by Kate Darling at MIT. And Kate's book, again called The New Breed, explores the intersection between, it's called, I think it's the subtitle is What Our History with Animals Tells Us About Our Future with Robots, and talks a lot about the idea that robots have this social valence and it's really hard to categorize them, and explains how that's also been the case in the past with animals, who are also treated in an interesting and separate and different way in the law. The other thing I think that I want to mention, and then I'm going to open it up shortly to questions, is that as robots become more sophisticated and they become more spontaneous and they display more of what I would call emergent behavior, meaning behavior that comes out of complexity but is not anticipated in advance by anyone, including the people that created the robot. As we get more emergent behavior, so will it be harder and harder for courts to figure out whether or not how to attribute liability and culpability, and also how to attribute rights like copyrights and things like that to these machines. And so we'll no longer really be able to say in an easy way that like robots can't be spontaneous or that robots can't be their own entities and they're always versions of people. It will be harder and harder to do that. And we already see that a little bit. So for example, in cases involving failures of automation in aviation, where planes have had problems that have related to aviation, courts have had to struggle to figure out, what was it? Was it the autopilot? Was it the pilot error? Was it some combination? Was the plane weighted wrongly? And they've had to struggle with figuring out who or what was to blame. Similarly, in driverless cars, there was a fatal crash in Arizona where it was very hard to figure out, was it the fault of the person who was paid to pay attention to the road and intervene if she needed to? Was it the fault of the Uber engineers who made some bad, sloppy decisions about safety? Was it the fault of the person who crossed the street against the not at the pedestrian crossing? Who was to blame here? And these kinds of questions I think will come up more and more. I have devoted a lot of my career to try to shed light on this. I teach tort law, which is the law where you sue someone else, like a private person, for some reason other than contract. So that's all products liability and car crashes and medical malpractice and all the different stuff. And so thinking about from that lens, I've written quite a lot about what to do about this. And so have more and more others. And so some of the other interesting examples are, something goes wrong with robotic surgery. Can you sue the manufacturers of the robot, or is it more like a scalpel or just a tool and really it's the doctor to blame? if a robot creates a work of art or writes a story, which seems to be increasingly plausible, who owns the copyright in that? And the data that it's based upon, how do we think about that for purposes of copyright? If a robot invents something, if an artificial intelligence invents something, who owns the patent in that, and so on. And so these kinds of questions are coming up more and more. And my own view is that courts will struggle. They will struggle both because they may not initially understand how robots work. One of the things I've seen as watching the internet unfold in internet law has been that over time, courts get more and more sophisticated about the technology. And so if you look at the Google v. Oracle case that the Supreme Court decided recently, it was very sophisticated about understanding how so-called APIs work and what the relationship was between what Google was doing and what Oracle was doing. And so over time, courts do become more sophisticated, but before they do, they may have bad mental models, wrong ideas about how robots work. But I think that will be corrected. I think the enduring problem will be this difficulty everybody seems to have with deciding whether robots are more like machines or more like people. Yeah, so that's all I wanted to share with you, and I'm going to stop sharing now so we can get to your questions. But I'm delighted to answer some questions for the next a bunch of minutes, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for the insightful presentation, Dr. Calo. I definitely learned a lot about all of these cases, examples that you mentioned. We do have a few questions in the chat, so I think it's a great segue since you started talking about like the future of robots in the courts. So someone is wondering that you mentioned multiple times the dilemma about whether robots should be determined as people or properties/machines by explaining the variety of examples. What do you think has been the general trend history of the courts, and what are your thoughts about how this will play out in the near future or the future?
Yeah, that's a great question, Katie. And so basically, what has been remarkable to me is that whether it's 1953 or 1999, or probably 2022, right? Courts continue to struggle with how to characterize robots as being like people or property. And again, it's also true of all of us. I mean, we continue. We don't get, though robots have been around for like a very long time at this point. Since antiquity, actually. There are references, before Christ to different kinds of robots and automation. Even though we've had them around forever, we seem to be no better today, and in fact, maybe in some ways getting worse with our reliance on devices like the Amazon Echo, in terms of treating things that aren't like people because they seem anthropomorphic to us. So I don't think that aspect of it is gonna change. Maybe the law will become more sophisticated and create a separate category or have some easier ways to deal with it. Like I said, when courts struggled to characterize imports for tariff purposes, eventually the legislature stepped in, or an administrative agency stepped in and changed the law so that courts didn't have to struggle with that. But I don't think it's going to be any better. So, for example, I have an RA, a research assistant, who periodically looks to see if there's been new cases. Just last year, there was another case where this is a funny one. If I'd been able to visually depict it, I might have included it. But it's a case in which basically somebody's building automobiles and subcontracts with a provider of robotics to help to build automobiles, and they don't meet their goals of production. Like, they don't make the automobiles as fast, or the parts of the automobiles as fast as they thought, and they lose a lot of money. And they're trying to figure out whether the fault for that, for not being fast enough, is with the workers who belong to the contractor, or the robots that belong to the subcontractor. Okay, and what happens is that at one point the workers in their testimony start to refer to the robots as being lazy. And then the question for the court, and then that upsets the subcontractors, who say, robots can't be lazy. This is like trying to personify them. I want you to strike this from the record. It's prejudicial. And so, like, the court had to decide whether or not it was prejudicial to call robots lazy. So we just keep, and this is like 2 years ago. You know what I mean? And so we don't seem to be getting any better at it. Whereas with some of the other stuff, like, how do we treat property rights? How do we treat creativity rather. How do we treat these kinds of things? Those things, I think that when as judges become more familiar with advanced artificial intelligence or robotics, they will become more comfortable making those sorts of decisions.
Definitely. And then next up, we have upvoted questions from Mr. Lara. So what are your thoughts on the use of police departments using the Boston Dynamics dog in the lawsuit filed by the NYC council member Ben Calo calling to ban police departments from owning or operating robots that will be armed with weapons? And a follow-up is, what could that potentially mean if an armed robot caused harm and or death?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the intersection of robotics and policing is a very interesting one. I should just say that there's no reason for you to know this, but I spent 3 years investigating allegations of police misconduct in New York City. So I'm pretty familiar with the police context in addition to the robotics context. And so, a couple things about that. Number one, you can totally understand why people would feel uncomfortable being policed by robots, both because of popular culture references to RoboCop, Terminator, just the sort of our unease about it. But more importantly and more directly, the places that robots have mostly been used has been in the theater of war. They're military, these robots in terms of their origins. So who's using drones initially? Who's using pack bots, which are those ground robots that can defuse bombs and things like that? It's the military. And so people are uncomfortable with robots in policing, in part because they're uncomfortable with the militarization of the police. But they also are uncomfortable because of the dehumanizing impact of being policed by a machine. It's not even a person. We're trying to get back in this country. We're trying to get back to at least community policing, if not, sort of rethinking entirely the way we do policing, so that the people that are responding to stress are not always these armed officers who are thinking about, public safety in a particular way, but rather people with different and deeper training who are responding to crises that people having in the community. So here we're trying to do that, right? We're trying to rethink policing. We're trying to make it more humane. And at the same time, these police departments are trying to introduce this military metal technology into the picture. It's just a bad disconnect, right? Now, what they will say is, well, look, you tell us that you don't want people to get hurt by the police, and we're hearing that. We don't want the police to get hurt. So why can't we just send robots in instead of the police? I mean, the way that police justify the use of force is almost always because they fear for their own safety, or they fear for the safety of the people around them. But usually it's like they say, I was worried about my own safety. I was worried that I was going to get hurt. That's how we justify the use of even deadly force. Well, if it's a robot, that robot does not have the same kind of rights. I mean, it's like, you can shoot the robot like the guy did in the example I used, and it doesn't hurt anybody. So, you say to yourself, well, maybe we should have robots, because that way, that we can de-escalate the situation and not use deadly force, because no one is really in jeopardy except for the person themselves who's having the issue, the defendant. Now, the counter to that is, when you send a robot into a situation, you often lack the kind of situational awareness that you would have if you were there in person. And even if you put a non-lethal weapon on a robot, the concern is that not being physically present and getting a sense of the situation and the environment, the people operating that robot will be hard pressed to make a wise decision about when to use force, even non-lethal force, right? And so it's a very complicated picture. And I'll tell you that I've never in my life gotten more phone calls from the press. I got calls from almost every major news outlet in the United States and many abroad when the Dallas police used a robot to stop somebody who was an active shooter. Even though they might have used a different means, they could have had an officer address the situation. Because they used a robot, it just made everybody's skin crawl. And so I got call after call after call after call. And so what I advised at the time, and what I advise now is, they should only use a robot after getting a tremendous amount of community feedback and having a defined written policy in place under where it's appropriate to use a robot and where it isn't. And so I think the DigiDog situation, what you want to see is, does the NYPD say, here's how we're using it, here's the circumstances where we will use it, here's the circumstances we won't. We'll commit never to put lethal force capability in it. I think that's a great idea, right? I don't think having robots with lethal force capacity is going to be good in the near future. And so on, if we do it at all. And I think there's lots of reasons not to. There's lots of reasons not to that has to do with community discomfort. So I guess I went on a little long about my answer there, but I think about this issue a lot, having a few years of a police background myself.
Yeah, for sure. That is a very, very valuable experience, I think. The next question is a bit more on the personal side. So someone is wondering about your experience in the tech policy lab that you mentioned at the start, and whether you could share a few memorable projects that you and or your students have worked on in the past.
Absolutely. I don't know if Helen, if I put something in the chat, will everybody be able to see it?
Yeah, if you chat panelists and attendees, they can see it.
Okay, so maybe as I'm talking, I will try to do this. Let me see if I can multitask. My friends and family will tell you that I can barely do one thing at a time, much less two. So let's see if I can do this. But one of the things I'm really proud of right now is something that's called telling stories. And I'm going to put it in the chat so people can see it. I know that folks who watch this in a recording won't be able to, but perhaps Harker could share it. But basically what it is we, at the Tech Policy Lab, one of the things we try to do, our mission is to help policymakers make more wise and inclusive tech policy. And one of the big issues that we work on has been artificial intelligence. And one of the things about artificial intelligence that you have to be candid about is it's developed in a particular context and it's deployed all over the world. So there's one set of people and they look a certain way, and they live in a certain place, and they went to certain schools, and so they're making artificial intelligence, the future of artificial intelligence, in Silicon Valley, in Seattle, in New York and Boston and other places like that, and Toronto and Paris and and London, and lots of particular places. But these places tend to have certain kinds of characteristics. And yet artificial intelligence is then deployed in all places, all different kinds of contexts, and it has these complicated cultural effects. So the Tech Policy Lab was thinking, how do we document that? How do we talk about that? It's a very hard thing to talk about. We could write some really esoteric paper that was all this theory about our post-colonial critique of artificial intelligence. I mean, that's valuable work, and people do that work, and we read it and rely on it. But we wanted to do something that was a little more accessible. So what we did is we invited people from around the world, from the African continent, from Australia, from the European continent, from the South American continent, all over the world, to come to Seattle and spend a week with us, thinking about this issue and writing short stories. Why short stories? Because storytelling, I mean, nothing's universal. I think that cultural differences are such that there's barely anything universal out there apart from our basic humanity. And things like language. But the truth of the matter is that storytelling is a recurrent modality. You see storytelling in all kinds of cultures in all kinds of different ways. It seems to be pretty closely linked to the human experience. And storytelling is also a very efficient way to get across complicated ideas to people, even if they're non-specialists. And so we used the power of storytelling. We did a story workshop, and we invited these people from all over the world to tell a story about how they thought artificial intelligence would affect their own culture. And so you have stories from Brazil, and you have stories from, just all over the place. And in fact, if you look at the link that I mentioned, you see Brazil, Chile, India, England, Canada, Rwanda, Cote d'Ivoire, Iran. I mean, just all over, right, the place. And I'm so proud of the way that it came together, because I feel like it really is representative, at least of particular individuals in those communities, and a lot of different issues get addressed. And so that was an effort of the Tech Policy Lab. And then we have this online version for free, and then we're going to make a book, a physical book that will arrive in May, that we're going to send to policymakers and just say, consider these things as you're thinking about setting policy for artificial intelligence. We're going to send it to the teams at Google and Facebook and others making artificial intelligence. We're going to send it to robotics labs. You see what I mean? Like, we're going to try to see if we can influence the conversation by using these voices that we've surfaced. So I'm really proud of that work. But we have a bunch of other work about open municipal data, or driverless cars, or augmented reality. We've done a lot of different work, and you can see it all on our website, and I'm proud of all of it. But that was a recent thing I wanted to flag.
Yeah, definitely. I think the short stories idea is so unique and new and very surprising to hear, even just from my perspective. So I'll definitely check it out in May when it comes out.
Yeah, and not only that, but I mean, just as a quick plug, Harker could do this. We've had undergraduates take our model, because in the Telling Stories book, we have a whole workshop template. So we tell you how to do it. And so it could be an assignment that you did in class, where you wrote short stories about artificial intelligence from your own perspective. And we have all the tools to do that in the book. And we've had undergraduates, even though it's only been out for a couple of months, we've had undergraduates already do it and publish their own stories online. And so I'd encourage you to check it out if you want.
Yeah, I think that would be really great, like interdisciplinary approach in practice. The next question is kind of on the fun one. So Aaron wants to know that from a legal standpoint, would it be reasonable to think of high-level robots as pets, or is that even a sustainable position to hold?
Yeah. So again, I it's a great question, and I highly encourage you to read this book, which I'm also going to find and put in the chat, just because it's a informal group here. But it's by Kate Darling, and she's at MIT, and it's called The New Breed. So there's long been this association. I'm just going to put this, and it's at a totally affordable $15. So there's long been this association in people's minds between animals and robots, precisely because we think of robots as having we think of animals as having some kind of agency, but not being quite like people. And that's an idea. So many people in the legal field have proposed that we should look to animals and animal law to figure out what to do about robots. So for example, there's court cases out there suggesting that if you have a bunch of sheep, or you have a bunch of cattle, and those cattle stray from where they're supposed to be and trammel someone else's land or wreck their fence or whatever, there's conditions under which the law will hold you, the cattle owner, responsible for what your cattle do, even though we don't think of cattle as being like having a will of their own. And then in medieval times, there were actual animal trials where people tried to blame the animals themselves and say that this was a bad animal, and the animal would go on trial, and someone would be like their advocate, and someone would be like their detractor. It was very interesting times. I don't think we should go back to that, right? So I don't actually think that, I think that there may be analogies for when robots cause harm, for the conditions under which to hold the people that built the robots or the people that own the robots responsible, that we could look to animal law. But I don't think we should be going back to the days where we put, robots on trial or animals on trial, or things on trial. I mean, Kate Crawford has pointed out that there's this notion of the deodand, which is an object that can be put on trial as well, which is fascinating. So for example, like a object will fall out of a window and hit someone in the head. And instead of like putting the people on trial who left the object out there, they'll like ask if the object was bad. I don't think that kind of thinking is going to be worthwhile. I will say though that there are times when the way people treat animals tell you a lot about the way they're going to treat other people. And again, this is just a bit of a warning. This is a little more a mature topic, but if you go into a household where there has been violence against people and you see animals, the usual response is to call animal protective services, because the kinds of people who do violence against their own family members also do violence against animals, and the reverse is true. So if you find violence against animals, you ask questions about whether the household is okay. And that kind of policy setting seems wise to me, because it just goes to like how the kinds of people that treat animals this way are also not good people, right? And they're going to treat people as well wrong. So you might be able to think at some point, if we get really sophisticated robots and there are people that mistreat them in a deep way, you know, who hurt them, even though we don't think intrinsically that the robot feels pain and then that matters. We might keep an eye on such a person and ask ourselves, you know, such a person, if they're going to be, you know, doing this terrible thing to robots, maybe we should keep an eye on them and see whether they're okay towards people and animals. So there's some possible associations, but we're very, very far, I think, from a place where we need to be worrying about the robots for their own sake.
Yeah, for sure. And then just for time constraints, this will be for our last question. And I actually want to ask this on behalf of myself, but I can't type it in because I'm a panelist.
Okay, yeah, sure, yeah.
So you mentioned briefly about like in the storytelling project, kind of gathering people around the world and asking all sorts of countries to participate in sharing their thoughts. I was wondering, do robots face different situations in courts in different countries, or is there a general global trend that every court shares in making these judgments?
That is an absolutely terrific question, and I do not know the answer to it. And Helen, maybe one day you'll be a law professor, because it's a very common thing that when you give a talk in law, someone asks you, have you thought about the comparative perspective? Have you thought about the way that courts treat this in other places? And I haven't. I mean, I have a project with a Canadian scholar, and we're looking at how courts in Canada and the United States have treated surveillance technologies, but that's not exactly how they treated robots, you know? And so, and I think it would be even better to do that with a country that wasn't physically attached to our own country, you know, or at least if it's going to be North America, extended to Mexico, for example, because I think that, of course, cultural differences may drive cases. I would love to find out how courts have treated robots in, for example, Japan. However, there is something I would flag, which is that you probably have to find a common law system, meaning a system where courts are making up their own law and the like. And so, you know, where courts are adjudicating cases and writing opinions, because that's not how it is everywhere. Other places have a civil law context in which most of the things are resolved by statute, and all the courts are doing is essentially deciding whether the statute has been met. And so in the civil law system, you're going to get radically different results because of the nature of the system. But you could compare common law systems, even in English, and probably get fascinating results. And if I do that, I'll credit you with the insight.
Sure, I would be very honored. All right. I think that's all the time we have with you today, Dr. Calo. A big thank you again for the wonderful keynote presentation and the very thorough answers throughout the Q&A panel. And thank you everyone for tuning in today. Friendly reminder that there will be more keynotes and panels coming up this afternoon, so be sure to visit our symposium webpage to stay up to date with the schedule. Hope everyone has a great one, and thank you again.
Thank you.